All right, welcome back. So here we are in Blender. We just have 3.3 opened up with the splash screen here. And before we really jump in, there are a few things that I want to set up, some preferences I want to change. And whether or not you need to make these changes really depends on the setup you have. So I'm just going to click anywhere outside of this splash screen to make it go away. And what that essentially has done is just opened up a new general Blender template. So before we kind of get into like the interface and stuff, I do need to make a couple changes here for my setup. So I'm just going to go to Edit and Preferences, and this will open obviously your Preferences window. So the reason that I'm doing this first is Blender relies pretty heavily on the numpad, which is, of course, if you're not familiar, the sort of calculator numbers on the far right side of your keyboard. My keyboard does not have a numpad, so that's immediately going to cause some problems for me. So I need to just fix something here. So I'm going to go to Input, and I'm going to go to Emulate Numpad here, and what this will do is essentially rebind all the shortcuts that are normally bound to the numbers on the numpad. It's just going to rebind those to the numbers that are above your letters in that top row on your keyboard. So if you have a numpad, you don't need to do this, but just know that anytime I tell you to hit like 1 or 5 or 7, if you haven't emulated a numpad, I do mean hit numpad 5 or 1 or 7. The other thing, I do need to change one keybind, again related to the numpad here. It's the shortcut that allows you to zoom your camera in on whatever you have selected is bound to the numpad period key. Again, since I don't have that, I need to rebind that. So I'm just going to type in the key binding here. I'm going to select key binding to search by the bind. So I just typed in numpad period, and the one I want to change here is this frame selected. So I want to change it from numpad period to just the normal one on the keyboard. And this one as well, control normal. Okay, so it disappeared here because I'm filtering by the keybinds, but that did work. The last thing I want to do just while we're here is enable some add-ons that come with Blender. So I'm going to come into this add-ons tab right here. And there's all sorts of add-ons here that you can enable to sort of expand the functionality of Blender here. And you can look through all of these or, however many you like on your own time. But there are a couple that I do use regularly that I want to make sure are enabled here that are not enabled by default. So if you scroll through this, there are some that are enabled by default. Do not disable any of these. You're going to probably need some of them. And if you disable them, well, you might not understand like why you can't find certain menu options and stuff because they're normally enabled by default. I hope that makes sense. Anyway, so the ones that we're going to enable right now are, the first one is going to be loop tools. So just in the search bar, go ahead and search loop, and you should get just one here that comes with Blender. It's going to be mesh loop tool. So enable that. This is just going to speed up some of our modeling processes, which we'll get to when we get to actual mesh modeling. And the other one I want to enable is the F2 add-on. So just type in F2 in the search bar, and this should only pop up one result here, which is this F2. Again, this is to speed up certain modeling processes just a little bit, and it's just really helpful for the workflow. So I'll cover what these actually do when we get into our mesh modeling units, but just enable them for now so that we are ready to go with that. So autosave should be on, but just in case it's not, you can always save your preferences like that. You'll get a message on here saying that they're saved, and you can exit out of that. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's take a look at the interface of Blender. Again, this is for people that are not familiar with the program already. If you are, you can either just skip this video or, just maybe watch it back at a quicker speed. It'll be a review, essentially. So when you first open up a new Blender file, which is what I have here, the main section of your screen will be what is known as the 3D viewport. And this is previewing essentially what we have, what our models are, what we have in our build. So every new Blender file will have 3 objects in it. One is this mesh cube right here. One is this is a camera and this is a light. So essentially what happens if you switch into rendered viewport, we have our cube here and we have it being lit from a directional light source here. Don't worry too much about these. We'll cover them more in more detail later. But let's just continue talking about the interface itself. So everything, all the modeling that you do and everything that you do in Blender is mostly going to be in this main window here, this viewport window. And this will show you what your objects actually look like. Over here we have our outliner, which is essentially just a hierarchical list of everything that is in our scene. So we can see our cube, our camera, and our light, just like I mentioned before. Clicking on these, of course, will highlight them also in the viewport itself. And all of these are contained in a folder, essentially, which is called collection, which we can collapse and expand. We can add new folders and all that. And that's just by right-clicking, we can, add a new folder. They're called collections in Blender, but essentially they're the same things as like a folder in your file browser. The next window here, this is the properties window. So this will give you all sorts of information about whatever object you currently have selected. So some of these are more global for the entire file, the entire scene, but you'll see that if I click on different types of objects, these menu options change. So to expand any of these properties here, these property windows, I should say, you can just click on their icon here, and there's all sorts of different options based on what you have selected. So this is a mesh object, which will make up the bulk of everything that we're doing in Blender is going to be made of a mesh object. Anything that makes up a physical 3D object is going to be made of mesh for the most part, except for some very special cases, which we probably don't even need to worry about in this course. So if I click on this mesh object here, I have my object properties, which will show me things like its location, its rotation, and its scale in the 3D world here, as well as some display options. Modifiers will allow us to sort of non-destructively edit the shape of this, which we'll cover more later. We have things like particles, which we probably won't get to in this course, but that's for instancing things at scale, like hair or grass. Physics properties, if you have any sort of physics simulation on this, we can, chuck it around the world and by giving it some physics properties. We have some more object data properties. We'll get more into vertex groups, UV maps, and probably some normal information. We'll get more into that later. And we have materials here, which control the surface look, basically. If I wanted to make this look like a certain material, such as like wood or metal, that would be controlled here through the material property. Again, I'm covering this all very briefly because we're going to talk about these things at length in future videos when they come up in our project. I just want you to be familiar with these windows and how to navigate around them. Lastly, down here we have our animation timeline. So if we were using Blender for animation, any sort of animation, information, keyframes, things like that would be down here, and we can play and pause and rewind and all that down here from the animation timeline. Now, I don't usually use this, so I will collapse it or just make it a little bit smaller most of the time. Up here we have our workspaces. So basically these are just presets for how to configure this space. So as you may have noticed, if you hover over any of these edges, you can configure these windows in any way you want. And if you hover over like a corner here, you can drag things over. You can add new windows by dragging down from the corners. And then you can change whatever type of window is displayed in this section by coming up to the drop down in the corner here and changing it here. So if I wanted to, say, use an image editor here, I could do that. And from here, I can open, a 2D image from my computer. So that is all about the interface and how to configure it. But these workspaces up here are essentially just presets for doing any of this. So the makers of Blender have very conveniently sort of configured different layouts based on what part of the workflow you are working on. So if I was modeling, say, I could tab over to this modeling tab here, and you'll see here it looks essentially the same as our layout originally did. We don't have the animation timeline down here. And it's also popped us into edit mode, which shows us sort of the makeup of this. We're going to talk about the edit mode versus the object mode in a future video, but just know that you can explore some of these. This is our sculpting tab, which will allow us to sculpt on our mesh if we had something with a little bit more density to it. UV editing, which we'll be using a lot when it comes to texturing and materials, as well as shading here. So this will be our material setup node. Again, if this is all gibberish to you, don't worry about it. We are going to be covering this more and more detail. I just want you to get a little bit familiar with the layout and the interface of this because it can be somewhat intimidating if you've never seen it before. So if you have done something like this, like I have, and sort of messed with your layout, you can always collapse these windows down. All you have to do is come into this corner here until you get the crosshairs, and instead of clicking right on this corner, you want to click a little bit into the window and drag it over the other one until it looks like this, release, and it will collapse that upper window. So I'm just going to do that again. And we are back here with our layout window. We're missing the animation timeline because I've collapsed it, but other than that, this is a default Blender scene. So the next thing that is most critical to know in Blender is how to move around your scene, how to move your viewport, your camera around your scene. Not this camera, but essentially our view here. So movement is pretty simple in Blender. All you have to do is click and hold your middle mouse button and move your mouse around to rotate around your object here. Shift, middle mouse click, and drag will pan around without changing the rotation angle, and scrolling your mouse wheel will zoom in and out. Now, if you don't have a 3-button mouse, meaning if your mouse doesn't have the scroll wheel, unfortunately you just kind of need to have one. There are certain preferences you can set, such as we did for the numpad here. We have an emulate 3-button mouse. However, it's just going to make your life a lot easier if you just get one with a scroll wheel. Pretty much any 3D program, be it Blender, Maya, Unreal Engine, anything like that, really hinges on having this 3-button mouse in order to navigate around the world. So you can emulate it, but it's just much easier to use a proper mouse with a scroll wheel. Now that we have covered sort of navigation around the viewport, I'm going to take a quick break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about how to start manipulating some of these objects in our object window.